Thank you, Lisa. I'm going to actually tell you a story. This begins with a fellow who is 7 years old. He's in the second grade in elementary school, in the Lincoln Elementary School in Norman, Oklahoma. Recess just ended, and all the children are lining up 2 by 2 to go back into their classes. I was one of those little boys, and right next to me was my friend Arden. I took Arden's hand, and I thought, oh boy, I really like Arden. I hope someday I'll grow up and we'll be like my mom and dad. That was the beginning of my awareness of who I was and that I was different. That's a story that probably applies to a lot of other people as well. By the time I reached age 14, 7 years later, I was spending some weekends and some holidays in my father's barber shop, which was just off the campus of the University of Oklahoma in Norman. And it was called Campus Corner, kind of like Dinkytown, if you know Dinkytown. In my father's barber shop, all of the guys from the engineering school, which was just across the street, and from the ROTC came in for their weekly haircuts. I would see these guys and think, someday I'd really like to marry one of these engineers. This is the kind of guy that I really like. They were all so nice. They were all so handsome. They were also very businesslike and serious. Just the kind of guy I liked. And at 14, that was my dream. That was 1956. By that time, I was riding horses a lot. We had horses. I had my own horse. Her name was Cherry. She was a Tennessee Walker, the smoothest gait you could possibly imagine, gliding around. And even during that time, in my hometown of Norman, there was what was called an Air Naval Training Station. They had a north base and a south base. And I would see from time to time the sailors in that town and even go horseback riding with them. So I really kind of got around but thought, you know, I'm the only one that feels this way. I'm the only one in the whole world that really likes guys in this way. So by age 14, I was starting to get a little frustrated. I thought, I'm never really going to meet someone. And then I graduated from high school, and as was expected, I went to the University of Oklahoma. I could walk there from my parents' home, and I was living with my parents at the time. So a pretty easy deal. I was in the student lounge one day, and I was between classes and kind of going over some material, kind of like you do over at Kaufman. And a young man caught my eye. I think this is called gaydar. I didn't know what that was. I'm 19 and I'm still pretty dumb. But this guy caught my eye. His name was Bob, it turned out. Bob turned out to be the man who introduced me to the world of gay people. This was something I had no idea existed. Even in my own hometown, growing up with all these people I went to school with, I didn't realize I had gone to school with a whole lot of gay people, including some guys that probably would have not minded dating. But as it turns out, I met Bob, and Bob introduced me to not only the people in my own hometown, but to this larger community that I didn't even know existed. Oklahoma was pretty, shall we say, solidly in the Bible Belt. And about the only thing I'd ever heard about the topic, if it was talked about was all, was in church. And after the first few episodes in church, I decided not for me, so I won't be going back to this church, which I announced to my folks. And they kind of weren't real happy with that, but they didn't ever try to force me to do things that I didn't want to do. Because, as my mom always said, well, Michael, I know you're going to do what you want because you're so strong-willed, but I just hope you'll think about this. So, Bob and I began to interact with the gay community in Norman at that point. I met a number of women and a number of gay men, and we began to socialize, go to parties. Everything was very quiet, very secret, not too public. And then, even though I wasn't yet 21, I went with Bob to some of the gay clubs in Oklahoma City. So there I found out the world is even still bigger than I realized. And so Bob and I actually lived together for about 4 years. So for the gay community, that was a pretty long-term thing in those days. Most relationships didn't last that long. But even during those years with Bob, we met couples. And this is something that really formed my mind very strongly about the possibility of marriage. Bob and I wore pinky rings. That was our wedding rings after we committed. But I met some couples who had been together for 20 years or longer, so I knew it was possible. I knew the reality was not what I was told, that relationships between gays were doomed. Fortunately for me, there were some things that were really important that happened during this time at OU. I was studying pharmacy. Bob was studying library science. We really became kind of a center of attention with many others because we had a longer relationship, and people began to think of us. And as often happens with gay couples, especially men, I don't know if this is so true of women, but with men, you kind of start to look alike. Yeah. And that was certainly true of Bob and me. So people who didn't know we were gay thought we were brothers, and they often said, "Are you two brothers?" So anyhow, Bob and I, after he finished his master's in library science, decided he was going to take a job in Lawrence, Kansas. And I hadn't finished pharmacy school, and by this time I was beginning to have some apprehension about pharmacy school. University of Oklahoma, where I was studying pharmacy, was a school that was focused on the business aspect of the profession, something that wasn't really resonating with me. Even though I came from a family of business people, it didn't really resonate with me. I couldn't see, as I like to say, I couldn't see myself standing behind the counter pushing pills for the rest of my life. So when Bob took a job at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, we decided we were going to relocate to Lawrence. So they had a pharmacy school, and I decided I would go to pharmacy school there. So after we moved to Lawrence, Bob began working at the University of Kansas Libraries, and I began working in pharmacy school there. Their focus was more on the research side of pharmacy, which to me made more sense since I was pretty much versed in the sciences and history of science at this point in my career, and I decided this is where I maybe belong. By this time, Bob and I were now into our second year, maybe a little more than our second year. And so we stayed in Lawrence for about a year, and then Bob got a job offer from Michigan and decided he was going to take a job in Detroit at Oakland University, which was a branch of Michigan State. And I thought, okay, I'll move to Michigan, and I'll think about the pharmacy school. But by the time we got to Michigan, our relationship had begun to change. We were now into our third, just about to start our fourth year, and it was obvious that this was not going to be long-term. Bob's focus on the relationship was very different from mine. Mine was much more focused on building a long-term relationship, on commitment, on love. And it wasn't that Bob didn't love me or I didn't love him. It was that the outlook for how that should happen changed dramatically. And so I began to think differently. We mutually agreed to end the relationship, and I decided I was going to go back to Oklahoma. I was not going to get back into pharmacy school. I was going to go back to Oklahoma, finish my degrees, and then I would perhaps look for someone else. That was quite a devastating blow to me. Bob was my first love, and I don't know if you know about first loves, but first loves are pretty intense. So it was pretty hard. I got back to Oklahoma. I spent time, moved back in with my parents. I spent time with my family, but I was in a pretty dark place. It was pretty devastating. It was very difficult for me to deal with the reality of that failed relationship. After a period of about 8 months, I call that my blank period in my life, I began to wake up a little because my mom said, "Michael, you have got to stop this. You have got to get out and be with friends and do things. This is not good." So I did, and Bob and I had made a very large number of friends in Norman, and many of them were still there, so I reconnected with the community and began to interact. This was about 65. In 1965, I also had continued relationships with my friends from Lawrence, Kansas, from when Bob and I had lived there, and so from time to time I was going up to Lawrence to interact with friends there. Had friends in Oklahoma now. My parents were a little happier because Michael's more optimistic and brighter, like he's supposed to be. And then I decided at one point I was going to go to a barn party. This was Halloween of 1966. This barn party was at a farm just outside Norman, my hometown, and I went with a friend by the name of Cruz Sanchez, who I knew from the university, and Cruz and I were pretty close buds, and he said, "You got to come to this party with me, it'll be fun." And I thought, okay, so I went. And then when we got there, Cruz was kind of the social center on the campus, so everybody knew Cruz. Cruz held big parties all the time and was always a social butterfly with everyone. But he said, "I got you here, Michael, because I want you to meet someone." And that's who he wanted me to meet. And he introduced me and said, "I think you two are destined for each other. You don't know that now, but you are." And I kind of rolled my eyes. I thought, yeah, right. But Cruz, as it turns out, was absolutely right. Believe me, when I first saw Jack, I thought, whoa, wait a minute, what is this? Here's a guy with a flat top at a time when everybody else was wearing, bangs. I mean, it's the Beatles, it's all this stuff. And he certainly didn't look like someone that I would expect to see in the gay community. But anyway, here was this guy, and I thought, I'm not sure about this. Is this just really some guy who's out looking for a one-night stand, or what is this? And Cruz said, no, Michael, you'll see. So I went home with Jack that night to a friend's house. I was there with some other friends. We went there and we stayed with this friend. And it was from there that I had my introduction to Jack Baker. He was an engineer. I thought, uh-oh, I'm 14 again. And then he's very businesslike, a serious guy. He's just coming out of the Air Force. And so it was kind of like, he's not like all the other gay guys I know here. And so as I began to know him more, he kept inviting me out for dates. After that first night, I went back to Cruz and said, I don't know about this, Cruz. And Cruz said, no. Remember what I told you. You two are destined for each other. And Jack began to ask me out. He said, let's go take in this movie. Let's go to this play. Let's go to the state fair. And over a period of months, he kind of started to grow on me. I thought, I really kind of like this guy, I think. I think he's okay. Then I remember one time, he was working as an engineer for the largest cement company in the state. He shows up at my folks' house, covered in all this dust from the quarry where he had been that day. And my mom took one look at him. She says, you need a shower. So she brings him into the house and she takes him down the hall to their bedroom, their master suite, and said, here's the shower. You can get cleaned up and we'll have dinner in a little bit. And my mom and dad were really cool. They were, by this time, they were very aware that they had a gay son, and we'd been through all that trauma, and pretty much my entire family was at the point of, you don't mess with Michael. You have problems with Michael, you got problems with our family. And I don't care if we're the sixth cousin, 12 times removed, you don't mess with Michael. He's our family. So, and my parents, I think, were just glad to see that finally, by the way, they loved Bob. They thought, I think they loved him more than they did me, frankly. But he was just a charming, really great guy, and they were pretty upset, after we broke up. But now I had another guy in my life, and he was obviously quite a nice guy. And so Cruz was probably right, it looked like. Now it's the first of the year, and I'm starting to think, is this the one? And then we get to March, and on March 10th, which is Jack's birthday, we went out to dinner and to a play, and we went back to his place, which was in Bethany, Oklahoma, a little suburb of Oklahoma City. And he said, Michael, I think we should be lovers. That's how you proposed to people in those days, And I thought, whoa, okay. I wasn't expecting this. I thought, this will come later, maybe. And I said, okay, but here's the requirement. If I'm going to commit to you, you have to agree that you will find a way for us to get legally married. So, on March 10th, 1967, I said, okay, if we can get legally married. By this time, I had done a lot of thinking about a gay relationship, about what I wanted out of a relationship, what I wanted my future to be. So I was pretty much ready when the question was asked. And it made a difference, I think, because he told me sometime later that I met his requirements for the kind of guy he was looking for. I was tall, I was thin, I was 20-something, and I always thought, how shallow. But, whatever turned you on. But what I really liked about it was that he was like me. He was not ashamed. He did not hide in fear. He was strong. He was determined, and he knew what he wanted. That was me. I never had fear. I never had shame. I never had guilt. I always had support for who I was and what I wanted to be, and who I wanted to be, how I wanted to conduct my life. So from age 19, when I had met Bob, my family knew about me, and so I lived in a secure, loving environment. I lived openly, you know. This is who I am. You don't like me? Your problem, not mine. Don't ask me how I got that courage. I don't know. As my mother said, you're strong-willed. I was strong-willed. So, I had a plan in mind. It was intentional, it was deliberate. I was going to be married, period. And if you're gonna be with me, you're gonna help me find the way to do that. In 1968, we both graduated with our masters. I took a job in Kansas City. He took a job with DuPont Corporation at their big cellophane plant as an engineer outside of Topeka, Kansas. And we lived in Lawrence. Again, I was back to Lawrence. What is it about Kansas City and Lawrence? Back and forth there many times. But when we moved to Lawrence, because that was halfway between our two jobs, we already had friends. And our friends from Oklahoma came up often to visit and would stay with us. So we had a built-in support group already. And we already had friends who lived in Kansas City, which was 25 miles away too. So we were kind of connected. In 1968, there was an awareness. About, in our minds, a pretty substantial awareness of the old homophile movement and of gay people as being widespread across the country. We had friends everywhere across the country. We were connected to people everywhere. And so our awareness was pretty strong. We were pretty sure at this point that somehow we were going to become involved in gay liberation. That's not what it was known as at that time, but that's kind of what we thought we were going to be doing. By the way, is somebody watching the time for me? Because, you know, once you get Michael started, good luck. Okay. Give me 3-minute warning or something. We were radicalized during this time in Lawrence because this was the height of the civil rights movement in Lawrence during that time. And there was a woman who had been fired from a Holiday Inn. She was black. And we were outraged, as were many others, and so we were demonstrating. We weren't doing things for gays at that point. We were almost there, but not quite. But that raised the awareness, and it radicalized us quite a bit. And then we went to Kansas City to a North American homophile conference, where Frank Kameny, one of the old-timers, I get to say that, old-timers in gay liberation, the old homophile movement, was there for the conference, and we met him. Jack had a fight going on with the Air Force about his discharge from the Air Force. He had been honorably discharged, and then after they found out he was gay, they came back and changed it to general, which is a red flag. But anyway, he was fighting that with them, and when we met Frank, he connected us into the legal world. And he was working out of Madison Society in Washington, D.C., and worked with a law firm there, the old Fortis law firm, actually, Justice Fortis law firm. And the attorney that represented him worked in that firm, and Frank Kameny knew this attorney and had worked with him on a number of federal cases. So he connected Jack up with that. So that got us moving, and then we decided, and I began, in my librarian role, to do research. So I started looking for everything I could find, everything. I did meticulous research and really turned it on heavy, big time. So by that time, we'd become much more aware and much more confident about standing up. We weren't quite sure what that was going to do for our jobs. Jack might have been a little more concerned perhaps than I would have been. I was in a private college that was pretty liberal, and I knew that there were quite a number of gay faculty on that campus besides just me, and I knew a lot of other people in Kansas City as well in my profession. So if I wasn't going to be doing some really blatant kinds of headline grabbing kinds of things, I probably could have been quite active without much difficulty. Wasn't so sure about Jack's world with DuPont at that point, but so what? So by the time we get through toward the end of 1968, Jack is starting to say, Michael, I think it's time for me to go to law school. We need to find a way to meet your dream of being married. So we started looking at law schools. It turned out that the University of Minnesota, one of the choices that we had, was an ideal one for us. We didn't necessarily know it at the time, but we were pretty sure. We knew that Minneapolis was a pretty liberal area, and that looked good. But the thing that really looked good to me was it's cold. Because I grew up in Oklahoma and Kansas, and I was sick of the heat. And the further north we could get, the happier I would be. So that looked really good. University of Minnesota was a big university, which was also really very attractive. And I started applying for jobs. And so once I got accepted for a job here at the university, Jack thought, ideal. I'm going to take the law school offer from University of Minnesota, and that's how we wound up here. He was already in 1969 in law school and cranking it up, and he found Free as a place to join, and ultimately became the president. That group was already founded, and he very quickly joined the group because that's one of the things he had planned to do, was to start a gay group on the campus, and lo and behold, he got here and Free was already here. So Stephen and Corinne had already taken that step and were moving along, so that just made it even more attractive. So in 1969, Jack decided to go to law school. Free was founded, as it turns out, the month before the riots at Stonewall in June of 1969. So this area was already on its way, and Jack moved into became Free's president, and worked there for quite some time, and really pushed the group to be out front and doing a number of actions and really getting the word out. Because one of the things that we understood when we began our move into the world of activism was that how do you get people to talk about something nobody wants to talk about? Nobody wanted to talk about gay people. Nobody wanted to talk about a lesbian or a gay man. Nobody wanted to talk about homosexuality. Those are taboo topics. And if you did, you could only talk about it in language that was pejorative. So we knew that the real key was to get people talking about the subject. And we also knew that if you really want to be free and a part of society, you had to step up and take the responsibility of participating in all of the institutions of society. That meant the most basic and one of the most important institutions of society is marriage. We began to talk about that right for gay couples like us. Committed, loving relationships. That's what we talked about. Frankly, for us, that presented a lot of difficulty because as part of the, quote, leadership in the early gay rights movement, that meant we were kind of treading on ground that pissed a lot of people off. Most gay men wanted to talk about sex and sexual freedom and getting rid of sodomy laws. They wanted to talk about job rights. They wanted to talk about all of those other things, public accommodations and housing and all of those other basic civil rights. Yes, we wanted to talk about those same things, we did, but we knew that those were only part of the loaf. If you really are going to step up and take responsibility, you gotta ask for the full loaf. And so for us, that was the game plan. Marriage equality had to be number one for us. And we had to have full and absolute equality, no exceptions and no excuses. And if you didn't have that, you were not fully an American. So we said, that's it for us. We paid a price for doing that, frankly. Like I said, in the 70s, most people didn't want to talk about that. They indulged us because we raised the profile. The first Pride in Minneapolis had 25 people having a picnic in Moore Park. It's a little different today. It's gotten a little bigger. But we pushed those envelopes. The gay and lesbian pride parades during those times quickly grew within a very short time to 500, then 1,000, then several thousand. And then over the years after we stepped back from that in 1980, it grew even more. That brings me to some other sidelights here, which I think are important to talk about. That is, what else was going on with us during that time? Marriage was a big deal. Jack ran for student body president. I got fired from my job at the university. I went to work for Hennepin County and embarked on a new career. We filed other lawsuits. There was the marriage lawsuit. There was my job lawsuit. Jack sued the VA because he wanted to, since we were married, he felt that he should be getting more on his GI Bill for going to law school as a result of having a, quote, dependent spouse. We sued the IRS because we wanted to file jointly. So we were kind of a legal sue machine during the time, I suppose, and we were working with a lot of other friends who were filing their lawsuits. Tom Higgins, who was a local person involved in the movement for a number of years, had a dispute with the Society for the Deaf and a number of other groups. So we were doing a lot of different things involving the law during this period. In addition to that, I adopted Jack during this time period because if we were going to have this lawsuit going on, we could adopt and get most of the rights of marriage. So we did that, and one of the sidelines of that adoption was that it allowed me to change his name, and it allowed me then to go to Mankato while our lawsuit was pending for the license in Hennepin, and actually get a license in Mankato. Got that license, and then the Reverend Roger Lynn married us, and we filed a license in Mankato. So that's still one of our things that even almost 50 years now later is still pending. We'll have that settled. Stay tuned. But one of the most important things that we learned during this fight was that we were beginning to see that we were becoming an obstacle to process. We'd now been on the public stage, we'd been on national television, we were in the press a lot. People saw us and heard us a lot. And our high profile and our insistence on marriage and full and absolute equality were really causing a lot of rifts. And what we saw was that it was dividing steps forward for progress here in Minnesota. We got gay rights in Minneapolis. We got gay rights in St. Paul after a little detour with Anita Bryant, which got taken care of. But what we could see was that it was becoming about us and not about progress. So in 1980, we decided we will no longer be public. We are going to get off the stage. I'm going to focus on my professional development, and Jack was going to close down his law office and keep a few clients at home and go back to engineering. And we were going to begin to build our own personal life privately and quietly while working on those issues that were of concern to us, quietly with others, both here and around the country. So that's what we did. From 1980 until today, we have continued to do our work. And we have continued to support people that we felt were really standing for what we stood for: marriage equality and full and absolute equality. Those are the things that we felt would transform everything. I think in those days, one of the things that we began to understand was that I like to say to Jack, we jerked people 45 years into the future before they even knew what we had done. And our vision, it took them 45 years to catch up with that. And that's what happened. So 45 years later, that happened. But those thought currents that we introduced in 1970, when we applied for that marriage license and were photographed, and that photograph went worldwide, those thought currents are continuing to transform the planet, even today. You can see now, as nation after nation begins to recognize, and even the UN begins to recognize, the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect, has come to fruition. And that will continue. We may not be here to see the end of that, but I think we're going to see most of it. It's happening so fast now that it's hard to predict. And now people are moving beyond even those labels that I've used earlier. Gays, lesbians. I didn't talk too much about the transsexual community, which was a part of our lives during that time. And today now, queer consciousness is beginning to arrive on the scene and transform, it's here, and is beginning to transform the scene. So a different level of awareness in human beings is taking place, and we are seeing that now. That's what part of this forum is about as well. I think it's really important to know that the future is going to be very bright, I believe. Don't pay any attention to the negative politics that are going on right now. When the vote comes next year, it'll start to change again. Just get registered and make sure you vote. That's all. But along with that, the currents of time are transforming the planet. Awareness on many levels, including the level that is close to us, are happening. They can't be stopped. The planet and the condition of humanity demands the change. It can't stop. The only way it can stop is if we wipe out 4 billion people. And I don't see that happening, so good luck with that. But what now? What now that we have marriage equality? Minnesota does pretty good, as well as a number of other places. We have what I call full equality in this state, except for the education that we will always have to do. That will never go away. As long as people stand up for who they are and believe and love themselves, that will just happen. I was just talking with Eva a little while ago about how the community, whatever that is, was so visible in the 70s. And now it seems to be so dispersed. I think the reason that that's true is it's something that I found unique here in Minnesota and that personally I liked. Yeah, there were sort of gay neighborhoods or gay areas, both in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and there were some places like in Rochester and a couple places in Duluth. You kind of knew in some places over in Wisconsin, they kind of had a gathering of people, but now people live where they want to. They live free, as they would like. I think the courage is there, and I think that's what our future is. I look here and what I see is that Minnesota continues to be a place, quiet, that's the way Minnesotans are, we're kind of not too brassy, but we have our own gay public library. We have one of the few archives in the country that is 6 million pages of blistering information. And we have a strong community with good leadership. We have an awareness, we have people willing to stand up, we have people who are willing to push back. That's what it takes. The next important thing for us is going to be to take care of our kids, to take care of our adults, our older adults. I'm speaking for myself here too. So that's important. We need to take care of ourselves. We now have a record. We need to use that record and our own experience to tell our story. We need to tell our story. Write articles, write books, go on the air, produce a documentary, produce a racy film, whatever it takes. Tell the story. Speak publicly, go to your neighborhood group, make sure that your issues, if they are issues that need to be talked about, are talked about. Be who you are, be authentic, and be real. It's that simple. Our future is very bright in this state, and I really have to tell you, Lisa is extremely important to me. I consider her a dear, dear friend because she is curating what I know is the power of our future. She has our record. She has a special duty to protect our stories. Our stories are important. And each of you should remember those 40 boxes, those 69,000 pages of documents that Jack and I gave to the Treader tell a story. That book, it's a tiny part of the thousands of stories that are in our record. But your personal record is also important. Don't think your record isn't important. Save your record, save your photos, save your thoughts, and give them to an archive where your story can be preserved as well. It's extremely important. That awareness is now starting to come up in our country. You're going to start to see more. I kind of follow gay film, and I've watched, I have a collection. I've got, I don't know, $25,000 worth of DVDs. Give me a break. It's hopeless. But I followed gay films and documentaries now for a number of years. And if you look at that development and you see how that has developed over time, you can see where we're going. The age of creativity has now arrived. So the records that we have, the records that you have, will allow for an amazing documentation of our history. So stand up and just have some fun doing it. That's it. I'm done. Just one little plug. This book, which the flyer is back over there, is it was written specifically for young adults. And the reason we wrote it for young adults was that, you know, your contemporaries, they aren't really impressed with you. But young people, there's a new group each year. There's a whole new group of people. They don't know our story. So we wrote this because what we found in this story was the story that every person experiences. So this will be used, according to the University Press, in curriculum as well as just for the joy of reading. So when it's out, I hope you will get a copy or check a copy out from the library. I know Minuteman has already told me they've ordered copies. So, thank you. Oh, yes, great.
So, if you have any questions, I know I was like jotting down notes and stuff. I have a few to start us off, and then if you have some questions, you can either do from your seat or come up so we can all hear you a little better. I was wondering if you could give us just like the tiniest information about the Managing Society and FREE. You said, if you remember what the acronym is, just to fill in those little pieces of history to start us off.
Yes, glad to. The Management Society was what was a part, there were several Management Societies. Management Society in New York, Management Society of Chicago, Management Society of DC. This is what those of us who were considered, quote, gay activists, that would have been late 60s, early 70s, that's when demonstrations started happening and all that sort of stuff started going on. The Management Society was formed mostly by people who were closeted, and they acted as an interface with police and government officials, often the mayor or the city council member or whatever, to talk about issues that were of concern to gay people. Raiding gay bars, arresting people in parks, and a whole host of other things. Those were the issues of the day. And then they began to put together sort of advocacies for civil rights. And they were the early parts of the movement, as we would know. Jack and I were a part of that group of people in the late 60s and early 70s who were kind of the transition between the old homophile movement. Believe me, they stood up, they picketed the White House and a whole lot of other stuff. They weren't exactly, not everybody was in the closet, but they were mostly fearful and apologetic, we felt. So they were kind of the early part of the movement. FREE was the first gay group on campus at the University of Minnesota. It stood for Fight Repression of Erotic Expression, and it was part of a course that was offered in the Free University by Corinne Phelps and Stephen Herrick. And that acronym, FREE, was a great one, quite frankly, to use because we didn't have to go on WCCO talking about fight repression of erotic expression and all of a sudden have people freaking out. But anyway, that's what that comes from.
Thank you.
Yes.
Can I add something to that? I believe there was another organization, headquartered in San Francisco, called SIR.
That's correct. There were SIR, the Dorian Society, and others, and Daughters of Elitis, which was the female equivalent. Those were part of those early movements. They were kind of pretty much the same thing. They kind of tried to get the cops to stop raiding the bars and stop busting people for being gay and trying to, talk about the rights. SIR stood for the Society for Individual Rights. Right. And by the way, that's the reason the archive is so valuable. You can go and read their newsletters and you can see the issues. And Lisa will help you find those.
I worked in the periodicals room at Wilson Library about the time that you were here in law school in 1970, and they had a complete collection of the publications, little magazines
Yes.
that Mattachine put out. And I don't know if that's there now or at Treader, but it's definitely worth looking at. I've forgotten the title of it too.
I think it was just called Sir Newsletter.
And the Mattachine Review.
Oh, and the
And-
Mattachine Review,
So
yeah.
one magazine was the first widely distributed homophile publication that started in 1953. Then Mattachine and then the Daughters of Belita started publishing the latter. So those were long-running newsletters and widely distributed. And then Sir had a newsletter, and some other Daughters of Belita had some chapters. They had smaller newsletters that went out, but the big ones that were published were one, Mattachine, and the latter.
Oh yeah,
were the
one
big
is the
three.
one I was thinking about.
Right.
Do you have that stuff now, or is it still at Wilson?
We have almost a complete run of one, starting in '53. And interestingly enough, for me, one of the things I talk about in the archive is those moments where you're surprised by things. So one started publication in 1953. Volume 1, issue 8, has a cover story on homosexual marriage, which I found remarkable. So what that said to me was that the gay and lesbian community started talking about marriage as soon as we had a way to communicate. Now, in that particular instance, the author, who was anonymous, argued that if you accepted the construct of marriage, you also had to accept the construct of fidelity, and the author wanted no part of it. So we also started disagreeing about marriage as soon as we had a way to communicate. But we have almost a complete run of one. We have quite a bit of the Mattachine Review, and we have almost a complete run of the latter, as well as many other publications, newsletters, books, personal papers, organizational records. And 34 wonderful, delicious boxes from Jack and Michael, full of photos and letters, and it's remarkable. They received communications from people all over the world in response to their application for the marriage license and their marriage, and it's amazing. It's an amazing collection.
Any other questions? I have more if you feel shy, but hear what else you have to say. Okay, on that note, you received correspondences from all over the world. I'm curious how other gays and lesbians responded to your push for marriage in context of it was not something that I think most people were fighting for. How was that received?
Well, I spoke a little bit earlier about the reaction of our contemporaries at the time. Although Jack and I were by and large, if you were talking about gay activists, we were older than most. We already had 5 professional degrees between us, and we were in our late 20s. Most of the people that we were activists with were in their late teens and early 20s, mostly. So we had a certain perspective that was perhaps a little more matured, and I mean that in the sense of not that we were smarter, but just we'd been around the block a couple more times, so we knew some things. But I think, tell me again.
The reaction of the gay.
Well, for the reaction to the marriage was quite frankly overwhelming. We literally had thousands of letters from people all around the planet and in multiple languages. But when I started going through those, just after I retired in 2010, I hadn't looked at this for 40 years. They'd been in boxes for 40 years. I started reading them, and I hope I won't do that now. But as Jack said to me, he looked up, I was going through these letters, and I was sitting there sobbing. And he said, "What's wrong with you?" And I said, "It's these letters. They were so powerful, you couldn't believe it. Even after 40 years, the feelings were there in everyone's words. Every individual's words were there. It was loneliness, fear, hope. Will I ever find someone? I can't believe you guys are here. And you're exactly what I wanted to do. How can I find someone? I really realized that gay people were isolated all over the country. Small towns, all alone, didn't know how to find anyone, but they wanted to find someone that they could share love with. That's what they wanted. So these letters, absolutely amazing, absolutely amazing. Some of them were heartbreaking. I mean, they were so painful. They were so painful. You could feel the pain of people. Others were just exuberant and liberated. They say, I'm telling my family tomorrow. I'm going to come out. And that was really powerful, very powerful. And I still remember one, I had to have this one translated, it was from Peru. This guy, people from different cultures are than American culture, are a little more formal in their approach, I discovered, at least during that time. So they were a little formal, and I kind of felt like, I'm not 90, you know. But that kind of was a warm feeling, but they were so amazed and felt so liberated. And I think that what that did was that it opened those doors in these countries all around the planet, and ultimately you see what happened. Yes.
Would you ever publish those letters?
I didn't hear the question.
Would you publish the letters that you received?
The Treader is going to, has ownership of those, and Lisa?
We would love to. The challenge that we have, frankly, with most of the material in the archive is that we don't own the copyright. So those letters will probably be made, public, published, put online in 75 years when the copyright expires. But right now, unless I go locate the author, if you write me a letter, you own the copyright on what you wrote. So I can't put them online right now. I can't publish them. I can't put them online. I would love to. It's one of the challenges of my archive as opposed to some of the other ones in the building, social welfare, immigration history, YMCA, some of that have older material that's over 100. They can do that with some of their material. Most of our material is from 1950, even more from 1970 on, and we don't control the copyright to it. So someday we will.
You can't see it at all?
No, it means you can see it, and it means that people who use the archive can use parts of letters if they're publishing something under a fair use standard, but it means that I can't take the full texts of the letters and make them available. But they are in the archive, and anybody who's interested in using the collection is welcome to do so. We love to have people come and use our materials, either Michael's or any of our other collections.
Let me just say that Jack has a slightly different interpretation of that. And the university gets to make its decisions about its possessions, and they possess our archive. But Jack believes that those letters are our property, and that we gave the university the rights to that. So they can pursue that where they would like to. But the reason we don't get into that discussion is that we would love for people to come to the archives and use the archives. And part of that is that Lisa is such a great guide to the materials that she will give them context that might not otherwise be seen by someone who's just looking at them cold. I can tell you that already some people have used those letters. And there are excerpts of those letters, some of those letters, in our own book. For example, there's one, the letter that my mom wrote us, for example, when we decided to apply for the marriage license.
I was struck by your saying around 1980 you decided that the focus on you was becoming a problem for the movement. Was that at all to withdraw as much as you did? Was that at all a difficult, painful decision, or was it mostly we've done quite enough, thank you, relief?
Well, there are two things here. There are two things here. I would say that it was a painful decision, but it wasn't nearly as painful, for example, as my breaking up with Bob. But the thing that made it difficult was that I really felt that the voice of love, commitment, and relationships was important, and that should not go away and be replaced by sexual orientation and the other kinds of discussions that were going on. Not that those were not important, you know, but I thought it was very important. And quite frankly, if you look at the swift movement of marriage equality in this country, notice what changed in that discussion. What was being talked about to legislators and to members of the public and in articles was love, commitment, and family relationships. That's when the public in this country began to understand what we were saying. That is something Jack and I knew in 1967. And we were bound and determined that that's what we were going to do. Now, you may look at me and say, yeah, right, you knew that back then. No, I knew. I knew. I wanted something more than 4 years. And I knew what that was. And I knew what it would take to get it. So, yes. But for the politics, we were toxic to the politics because we would not accept anything less than full and absolute equality. And if you were going to take a crumb from the table or half a loaf, we were going to be in your face. And it was that simple. Pissed a lot of people off. But that's okay. It was time for us to get off and let new people take on those roles. It took them 22 years to get rights in this state, and it took them 45 to get marriage, but I'm very patient. You had a question.
I was wondering how people all over the world got your address to write to you, and also who were some of the very first straight officials who said to you, yeah, why should gays be able to get married? Like, who were on your side at that time?
Well, surprisingly enough, it was people, if we're talking about politicians, it was people on both sides of the aisle, actually. Arnie Carlson, who was governor in this state, we were friends with him, and when he was married to Barbara Carlson, we were friends of theirs, and we would, you know, from time to time be in their home or be at a fundraiser or something with them. And then there were DFL politicians. Of course, we were DFLers ourselves, so we knew people there. Unfortunately for us, people who were in political office were scared. That's why it took 22 years to get rights in this state. I think they were afraid. We were not afraid because we knew that if you were going to get people on your side, you had to talk about it. And the strategy on the other side seemed to be, don't embarrass anybody. Don't say anything that will enlighten somebody. Just let us work behind the scenes. That doesn't work. It just flat doesn't work. And we knew it. But we had rights in Minneapolis. We lived in Minneapolis. We got married. They'll catch up. That's it. You know, I don't want to name names for people who were on the other side. You probably can figure out who those people were at the time. But most of them have come around. You know, it's the education. Come out and be yourself. Be authentic. Be real. And just tell your story. Live your life. If you do that, people will accept you. That's just it. And they will understand why you deserve the same protections as everybody else.
And how do people know where to write you?
Oh, well, let me put it this way. The post office was very, very good at that time. One letter arrived in our mailbox. It was addressed to the homosexuals at the University of Minnesota. We got it. Jack was the darling of the media. What can I say? People knew who he was and where it was. So, but yeah. And for the others, we were in Look magazine. You may have seen the slides up here running a little earlier. Those slides depicted Look magazine, and then we were on the David Susskind show, which was a national talk show. And Phil Donahue and Kennedy and Company and others. These people had audiences of 20, 30 million viewers. And people would write those shows and they would forward the letters on to us. People would see it in the newspaper and they'd forward it to the AP or to the Star Tribune, and they would forward those things to us. So people would find us. People would, a lot of those letters just came to the university. They would just come, University of Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we would get those. So, but people had a way of finding us. Some people found our actual address, which is pretty amazing because Jack is pretty private and very secretive and really you couldn't find us in a phone book. Good luck. But people found us. I don't know how they did it, but they did. Yes?
Were you involved at all in the latest cases that went to the Supreme Court about equality? Did counsel contact you? Did you file amicus briefs? Were you involved in the strategizing that went into it? Anything?
No.
You were totally
No.
out of it.
Let's just say this, if you read the briefs of Baker versus Nelson, our case that went to the Supreme Court in 1971, if you read that, you will see that basically the arguments in that brief are the same arguments that were made this time. That's like I tell you, the arguments of the other side, same arguments they made in 1970. They're just as bankrupt and illogical and crazy now as they were then. You know, I say that with all disrespect. Because I'm kind of fed up with that. You know, I grew up with that in Oklahoma. You know, I stopped going to that Baptist church on Sunday after I saw what they were saying from the pulpit and realized if these people knew who I was, they'd probably kill me. And I went back to Oklahoma at one point, was talking with my older brother, and he said to me, you know, Michael, if you and Jack had done that here, you would be dead. They would have killed you. And maybe they would have, maybe they wouldn't. I don't know, maybe. I never lived a life of fear or apprehension or let others try to censor me. I just couldn't do that. Just couldn't.
Good for you.
Maybe one more question. Anybody has one?
Yes.
I was wondering if you could speak a little more about the practice of like adopting your partner as a form of legal protection.
Yeah. Adoption is an interesting thing. One of the other suits that I didn't talk about, by the way, is that Jack and I applied to adopt a child. So another lawsuit that went no place for us, unfortunately. But adopting Jack, we realized that, let me just state this. In 1970, Jack was in law school. I lost my job at the university. We had some savings, not much, but some savings. And we were living on his GI Bill for his tuition and living expenses, which amounted to, and I know this is not today's dollars, $75 a month. So we looked at adoption as a way of helping that bottom line. It would help us do that. It would help us do that. But Danny Berenberg, the guy who helped us with the adoption, he's an attorney, still a friend. He lives in Florida now. But Danny told us, you know, you can change his name. So then our mind really opened. We thought, oh, not only will this help us with all of those other issues that marriage would provide for us, but it would also allow us to perhaps pull a fast one, to get a license. Change Jack's name to something that's gender neutral and apply for the license and get the license. And we did that. So, but the adoption at that time was something that was generally not done for adults, but it was permitted. That allowed us to explore that option. Not many adults did that, but after we adopted, and then that came out in either gay publications or the press, the general press, a number of other gays we are aware of also looked into that as a possibility, just because they wanted to deal with their whole issue of how do I pass this on, what if something happens to me and I'm in the hospital, you know, all those things. That helped us with those issues.
Does that mean, yeah, as Jack's legal father, you had access to his VA, or you got?
No, he's not the father. Actually, figure this one out.
I thought you adopted him.
I adopted him, so he's my son,
Right.
and he's 2 months older than I am.
Does that mean you got benefits from the VA then? as legal
No, that
guardian?
was another lawsuit. They didn't, they wouldn't, they said they were not going to recognize the marriage, just like the IRS. They said,
But
well,
that was the, part of the attempt was to do that? Okay.
that's right, that's right.
For the legality of your marriage, did you have to void your adoption?
No,
How is that?
no, we're unrelated
Okay.
by blood, so that was not a requirement. See, the law's really weird. And interesting. And interesting. That's, Jack, you know, I'm just bragging a little bit. I think he's one of these people who always sees things that others don't see. He just, you know, he was in his course on legal research, and he went in and read the marriage statutes, and no place in there did it say man and woman. It said the persons. And so there's no requirement that it be of a particular gender. And so he said, But with regard to other areas of law, same kind of thing. The guy's just really smart, you know.
I always thought that it was you that changed your name to Pat. You're saying he's the one that changed it?
He's the one, yeah. His name is actually Pat Lynn McConnell. Yeah. My family kind of liked that, actually. Jack is the youngest of 10 children, and his parents both passed away when he was about 4 or 5. And so he was raised in a Catholic boarding school, and he had his other siblings, he hardly knew them. When we decided to get married, he called his family together and was going to make the announcement and wanted them to assure him that I would be welcome in their homes. And all of his brothers and sisters, except for one sister and her husband, said, don't come around while we have children. And so he basically at that point said, you are no longer my family. So Judy and Jean, his sister, who said, you got your problems, I got mine, so what? So Judy and Jean are the parts of his family, and in later years, nieces and nephews who have sought us out are parts of our family. My family from day one said, you mess with Mike and Jack, you mess with the family. Don't mess with them. So my family is his family, basically, in our world. And Judy and Jean, and all the nieces and nephews. And we love. The rest of our family is created. They're the people we love and care for, like Michael.
Megan has a question.
You've made reference a few times to being fired from the university. I'm curious to hear a little more about that.
Do you need help? I have a quiet voice back there.
Oh, you referred a few times to being fired from the university, and I'm curious to hear more about that.
Oh, well, here's how the deal worked. I was hired to be head of cataloging for the St. Paul campus. And I was one of these people at that time who was learning about automation in libraries. That translates into computers. So I was kind of a, whoopee, let's get this. This is hard to find. And so I had accepted the job, and Ralph Hopp, who was the director of libraries at the time, I'd come and interviewed and met staff and all toured the university and all that stuff. So I was under contract at Park College in Kansas City. I declined to renew my contract with them. And Jack had already done the research. So he said, you got the job, we're good. So come here, we'll apply for the license the day before your birthday, and then it'll be in the papers on your birthday. So that's what we did. Of course, when it hit the papers, immediately the Board of Regents met, and they began talking about how do we rescind this job offer. And it turns out that in the university, the regents, as with everything, have the final say. And since they had not yet affirmed my being hired, they said, we withdraw that job offer. It's the first time that they had done it in anyone's memory. And that created a huge controversy on the campus, as it turns out. There were demonstrations and all kinds of stuff for a period of time. But in the end, it all turned out great because for a period of about 2 years until 1973, I was involved in gay liberation and working part-time, and then I got hired by head of the county library and my career took off. So it was a blessing in disguise for me. There's one thing that I didn't mention in the talk. I always forget something. And that is Gay House. Most people don't know about Gay House, but Free was at one point, at that point in time, the only organized GLBT group around in Minnesota. As a result of that, since I didn't have a particularly fond view of the university at that point after they fired me, I decided, I don't know if I really want to be associated with this too much. It's a campus group and I'm not really a faculty member or a student or whatever. And by that time, John Preston, who later became editor of The Advocate and an author and was an activist, had moved to Minnesota. And John and I began to talk about this whole idea. And he was working with the faith community here. He was at the time going to seminary. And he was also working with the medical school at the university. So we were looking at a much broader need than the activism of the campus. And he said, you know what we really need here is a social service agency of some kind, or a drop-in center or something for people in the broader community, because the only place for people to go was the bars. And a lot of people really didn't like that kind of an environment. They felt that it was not a good environment for them. And so, to cut to the chase, I worked with John, and Jack helped us, as did some others, and we worked with a couple of ministers. One of them was the one who married Jack and me, Roger Lynn, and another one, Jim Clayton, who were in the United Methodist Church. And they helped us get a grant from the Minnesota Council of Churches to form a group, and we named it Gay House. And it was on Ridgewood Avenue over just south of Loring Park, up on the hill overlooking downtown. And Gay House was a drop-in center. The first director of Gay House was Cindy Cindy Hansen. God, Aarons, I used to work with somebody named Cindy Aarons. But Cindy Hansen was the first director of Gay House. And the reason I mentioned Gay House was that this was during the hippy-dippy world, you know? And it was a place where people came and dropped in and rapped and talked. But John and I worked with a whole group of people, including care providers and others in the faith community and others, to get counseling services, medical services, crisis counseling, and a whole host of other things. So we created this whole network of services to work with people. And out of Gay House came other organizations. Lesbian Resource Center eventually came out of this. Gay Community Services came out of this. Minnesota Council for the Church and the Homophile came out of this. And a whole host of others, including a number of political groups, came out of this. And Gay House hosted the first Pride, which was in Loring Park, like I said, 25 people. So,
What years did it exist?
It was from about 1970, it actually opened in 71 and was around for about 10 years. And those documents are on file in the Treasure Collection, by the way. You can read all about Gay House, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there's some ugly.
Yeah, you mentioned the medical school here. A lot of people have forgotten that this was one of the few places in the world where you could get transsexual surgery back then in the 60s. And there were some famous people who did that. And
That's right.
And what's even more unbelievable is the state Medicaid program would pay for it.
Right. That's right. There was a whole, I call it a coven. I think that sounds kind of fun. At the medical school. And they were doing a lot of human sexuality education. And Tom Maurer, who had come from San Francisco here, was working in the medical school. He was a minister who came here and worked with the medical school on producing all of this sex education and other kinds of materials that the medical school worked on for quite a number of years. This was all going on at the same time that stuff, the Kinsey Institute and a lot of other stuff was going on around the country as well. It's all, most people don't see that part of the history. It was all interconnected and very quiet. But yes.
We'll take this last question, Marina.
It's kind of a generic question, but how have you guys made it for 50 years together?
When I commit, you're mine. And Jack told me early in our relationship, he said, you know, the most important thing to me is that when I am old, I want to have companionship. And I want it to be someone that I love. And believe me, there have been times when maybe a word wasn't spoken for as much as a week. There have been times when the neighbors 2 blocks away could hear the screaming. There have been things where we just say, you know, you're just full of shit. And you just live with that, because I'm going to let it go. And that's, you know, any relationship, it's the commitment to one another, no matter what. And you grow and change, the relationship grows and changes. And if you're a person who can live with change, that's great. I think Jack's a little more rigid than I am. Maybe that's because of his background. He was raised as in a Catholic environment, which I think to me seemed a little more formalized in the way he approached things, but that gave him discipline and commitment to prevail. For me, I grew up in a little more free-form kind of an environment, so change, who cares? We'll just do something else, we'll just fix it. But my core is there. So my core with him No one can touch that. No one. No one.
That seems like a good ending. Thank